At the family gathering, my mother smiled and announced, "We're expecting another baby." Applause filled the room, but my chest burned. I slowly stood up, took a deep breath, and said, "Maybe everyone would also like to know who the father really is." The silence was immediate, and I left before anyone could react. The autumn air hit my face like a slap as I stumbled out of my childhood home, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force I thought it might shatter them entirely. Behind me, through the dining room windows that glowed warm and golden in the October evening, I could see the silhouettes of my family frozen in tableau. 23 relatives who had gathered to celebrate what they believed was joyous news, now sitting in stunned silence around the mahogany table that had hosted every important family moment for the past 15 years. My mother, Helen, stood at the head of that table, her hands probably still resting on her barely visible belly, her face undoubtedly drained of the radiant glow she'd worn just moments before when everyone had been congratulating her and Robert on this unexpected blessing. At 47, she'd told everyone, she'd never imagined she could conceive again, not after Marcus and I had grown into adults who rarely visited home anymore. Robert, my stepfather for the past decade, the man who'd raised me since I was 12 and loved me like his own daughter, was likely staring at the empty chair where I'd been sitting, trying to process the bomb I'd just detonated in the middle of what should have been a celebration. My brother Marcus, 25 to my 28, was probably looking between our parents with confusion, maybe even anger at me for disrupting what had seemed like genuinely happy news. Marcus had always been the peacekeeping, the family diplomat who smoothed over conflicts and maintained harmony. He'd be furious that I'd chosen such a public moment to create chaos, but I couldn't have stayed in that room one more second, listening to congratulations and watching relatives plan baby showers and discuss nursery decorations, knowing what I knew. The weight of the secret had been crushing me for 6 weeks, ever since that afternoon when I'd stopped by Mom's house unexpectedly and seen her car in the driveway alongside another vehicle I recognized, but hoped I was wrong about. The sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway made me turn around. Uncle James, Mom's older brother and the unofficial family patriarch, was walking toward me with the measured pace of someone who'd spent 40 years diffusing family crises. "Daphne," he said quietly, "I think you'd better come back inside and explain what you meant by that." "No," I replied, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "I think Mom should be the one doing the explaining." Uncle James studied my face in the porch light, and I saw the moment when he shifted from dismissing my outburst as some kind of emotional breakdown to recognizing that I possessed information that could change everything. "Who?" he asked simply. The single word hung in the cold air between us. Who was the father of my mother's baby? Who had she been seeing behind Robert's back? Who had managed to destroy the stability of the one family relationship I'd thought was unshakable? "Dr. Harrison," I said, the name feeling like poison on my tongue. "David Harrison." Uncle James's face went ashen. David Harrison wasn't just Mom's longtime friend and former colleague from the hospital where she'd worked as a nurse before becoming a stay-at-home mother. He wasn't just the family physician who'd treated Marcus and me through childhood illnesses and injuries. He was also Uncle James's business partner in a medical practice they'd built together over 15 years. And more importantly, he was the husband of Aunt Claire, Mom's best friend since college, the woman who'd been her maid of honor at 2 different weddings. "Jesus Christ, Daphne," Uncle James whispered. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" The memory of what I'd witnessed 6 weeks ago flashed through my mind with painful clarity. I'd let myself into Mom's house using my key, calling out to announce my arrival, when I'd heard voices from the living room that made me freeze. Mom's laugh, but breathless and intimate in a way I'd never heard before. A man's voice responding, low and affectionate, saying words that no family friend should be saying to a married woman. I'd crept closer to the doorway and seen them on the couch, my mother and Dr. Harrison entwined in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. They were so absorbed in each other that they never noticed me backing away, letting myself out the front door, and sitting in my car for 20 minutes trying to process what I'd witnessed. "I'm certain," I told Uncle James. Through the dining room windows, I could see that the family gathering had dissolved into small clusters of people having urgent, whispered conversations. Robert was nowhere to be seen, probably in the kitchen or den, trying to process this revelation away from the crowd. Mom was sitting at the table with her head in her hands, while Aunt Claire rubbed her shoulders in what would be heartbreaking irony if she knew the truth. "What do you want to happen here, Daphne?" Uncle James asked. "Because once this gets out, and it will get out now, There's no putting it back in the box. I looked at the house where I'd spent my teenage years, where Robert had taught me to drive and helped me with calculus homework, where he'd walked me down the aisle at my own wedding 3 years ago because my biological father had never been part of my life. I want the truth, I said finally. I'm tired of being the only one who knows. 6 weeks earlier, I'd driven to Mom's house with homemade soup and the naive intention of surprising her with an impromptu lunch. She'd been complaining about feeling under the weather during our weekly phone calls, and I'd thought some sisterly care might cheer her up. The irony of my timing would haunt me for months afterward. The key turned easily in the familiar lock, and I called out my arrival as I always did, balancing the soup container and my purse while kicking off my shoes in the entryway. Mom, I brought lunch. The house felt different somehow, quieter than usual, but with an undercurrent of energy that I couldn't immediately identify. That's when I heard her laugh. It wasn't the laugh I'd grown up hearing, the one she used during family dinners or phone conversations with friends. This was intimate, breathy, filled with an affection that made my stomach clench with sudden understanding before my brain had even processed what I was witnessing. I crept toward the living room doorway, some instinct warning me to approach carefully, and that's when I saw them. My mother, Helen Morrison, 47 years old and married to Robert for 10 years, was curled against Dr. David Harrison on the couch where our family watched movies together. His hand was stroking her hair with the tenderness of long familiarity, and she was looking up at him with an expression I'd never seen her wear, completely unguarded, luminous with happiness. I can't believe we're finally going to do this, she was saying softly. After all these years of talking about it, of wishing things were different. I know, Dr. Harrison replied, his voice gentle in a way that spoke to years of hidden intimacy. Claire will be devastated, and Robert, he trailed off, shaking his head. Robert will survive, Mom said with a coldness that made me flinch. He's a good man. But David, I can't keep pretending that what we have is enough anymore. Not when I know what real love feels like with you. I backed away from the doorway so quickly I nearly knocked over the umbrella stand, my heart pounding with the force of a revelation that rewrote my entire understanding of my family. Dr. Harrison, Uncle David, as Marcus and I had called him growing up, had been our family physician since we were children. He'd given us vaccinations, treated our strep throats, set Marcus's broken arm when he fell off his bike at age 10. More than that, he'd been part of our extended family circle for as long as I could remember. He and Aunt Claire had been dinner guests at least once a month for years. They'd vacationed with us, celebrated holidays together, been present for every major milestone in our lives. I'd grown up thinking of them as permanent fixtures in our world, as stable and reliable as the changing seasons. I'd let myself out of the house without confronting them, spending the rest of that afternoon driving aimlessly through neighborhoods where I'd never lived, trying to process the implications of what I'd witnessed. The soup container sat forgotten in my passenger seat while I grappled with questions that had no good answers. How long had this been going on? Were they planning to leave their respective spouses? What would happen to our family dynamics when the truth came out? And most pressingly, what was I supposed to do with this information? The ethical answer seemed obvious. Stay out of other people's business, let adults handle their own relationships, focus on my own life and marriage instead of getting involved in family drama that didn't directly concern me. But the emotional reality was far more complicated. Robert had been more of a father to me than my biological dad ever was. He'd adopted me legally when he married Mom, giving me his surname and treating me with the same care and attention he showed Marcus, his biological son. The thought of him being betrayed and humiliated by the two people he trusted most made me physically sick. But Mom was my mother, and despite our complicated relationship, I loved her. I'd watched her struggle through a difficult first marriage, seen her work to rebuild her life as a single parent, witnessed her joy when she met Robert, and found what seemed like lasting happiness. If she was having an affair, there had to be reasons, problems in her marriage that I wasn't aware of, needs that weren't being met, complications that an outsider couldn't understand. For 6 weeks, I carried the weight of their secret while trying to maintain normal relationships with everyone involved. I had dinner with Robert and Mom, listening to him talk about retirement plans and vacation destinations while knowing his wife was betraying him. I attended family gatherings where Dr. Harrison and Aunt Claire socialized with my parents, watching him touch Claire's shoulder affectionately while secretly conducting an affair with her best friend. The strain of maintaining normalcy while harboring such explosive knowledge had been slowly destroying me. I'd lost weight, developed insomnia, started snapping at my husband Michael over insignificant irritations that normally wouldn't bother me. And then, at today's family gathering, when Mom had announced her pregnancy with such radiant joy, I'd felt something break inside me, because I knew, with absolute certainty based on what I'd overheard, that the baby she was carrying wasn't Robert's. The explosion I'd detonated in the dining room had set off a chain reaction that was still reverberating an hour later. From my position in Uncle James's car, parked halfway down the block from the house, I could see relatives streaming out the front door in small groups, their animated conversations carrying on the night air like the murmur of a disturbed beehive. "You can't just drop a bomb like that and disappear," Uncle James said for the third time, though his tone suggested he understood why I'd needed to escape before the immediate fallout. "Your mother is in there having what looks like a complete breakdown. Robert has locked himself in his study, and half the family thinks you've lost your mind." "And the other half?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The other half is remembering things they probably should have noticed before. The way David looks at Helen during family gatherings, how often he stops by when Robert's at work, the fact that Claire has been complaining for months about how distant he's become." Through the rearview mirror, I watched my cousin Sarah loading her 3 young children into her minivan with the efficient haste of someone who wanted to remove innocent parties from an increasingly volatile situation. Sarah's husband was already on his phone, presumably calling other family members to spread the news, or possibly verify what I'd revealed. "Where do you think she'll go?" Uncle James asked quietly. "Who? Mom? This situation can't continue now that it's public. Helen will have to make choices she's been avoiding, and so will David." He paused, studying my reflection in the rearview mirror. "Are you prepared for the consequences of what you've started?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. Was I prepared for my mother to leave Robert? Was I ready to watch their 10-year marriage disintegrate because I'd chosen to reveal a secret that might have remained hidden indefinitely? Could I handle the guilt if Robert, the man who'd been more of a father to me than my biological one ever was, ended up devastated and alone? I couldn't let him live a lie. I said finally, "He doesn't deserve to raise another man's child without knowing the truth, and if Helen leaves him for David, then that's her choice. But at least it will be an honest choice instead of this deception." Uncle James turned to face me directly. "Daphne, there's something you need to consider. If this affair has been going on as long as I suspect it has, then David has been lying to Claire for years. And Claire, she's not just going to be heartbroken, she's going to be humiliated in front of the entire family. Her marriage destroyed by her best friend's betrayal. The weight of that implication hit me like a physical blow. Aunt Claire, who'd been like a second mother to Marcus and me, who'd hosted birthday parties and provided comfort during difficult times, who'd spent tonight rubbing Mom's shoulders and offering support while her own husband was the father of the baby Mom was carrying. "She deserves to know, too," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "Does she? Or would she have been happier living in ignorance if David had eventually ended the affair and returned his focus to their marriage?" Before I could respond, the front door of the house opened and Marcus emerged, looking around until he spotted Uncle James's car. He walked toward us with the determined stride of someone who'd been elected to handle an unpleasant task. "Family meeting," he announced when he reached the car window. "Mom wants to see you. I'm not ready to face her yet. Tough, because ready or not, this is happening. You can't make an accusation like that and then hide while everyone else deals with the aftermath." Marcus opened the car door and waited for me to get out, his expression making it clear that cooperation wasn't optional. Uncle James nodded encouragingly, apparently agreeing that avoidance wasn't a sustainable strategy. The walk back to the house felt like approaching an execution site. Through the windows, I could see that most of the extended family had indeed left, but the core group remained. Mom, Robert, Dr. Harrison, Aunt Claire, and a few others who were either too invested in the drama to leave or felt obligated to help mediate whatever came next. When I entered the living room, the sight that greeted me was exactly what Uncle James had described. Mom was sitting on the couch where I'd seen her with Dr. Harrison 6 weeks earlier, her face red and swollen from crying. Robert was standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Dr. Harrison was notably absent, though Aunt Claire sat beside Mom, still offering comfort to the woman who'd been betraying her. "Sit down, Daphne," Mom said, her voice hoarse but steady. "It's time we all heard exactly what you think you know." The living room felt like a courtroom as I took the chair directly across from Mom. Every pair of eyes in the room focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Robert remained standing by the fireplace, his face carved from stone, while Aunt Claire perched on the edge of the couch beside my mother, like a loyal guardian protecting her best friend from unfair accusations. "Before you say anything," Mom began, her voice controlled but trembling slightly. I want you to understand that you've just destroyed multiple families based on whatever you think you saw or heard. I hope you're prepared to live with the consequences. Where's Dr. Harrison? I asked instead of responding to her statement. David went home, Aunt Claire said quickly, her voice sharp with protective anger. He was understandably upset by your accusations, Daphne. The man has been treating our family for 15 years, and you've just accused him of— She couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Of having an affair with my mother, I completed. Which he is. That's enough. Robert spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone fall silent. Helen, I think it's time you told us exactly what's been going on. The way he said my mother's name, formal, distant, completely devoid of the warmth I'd always heard when he spoke to her, sent a chill through the room. This wasn't the voice of a man preparing to defend his wife against false accusations. This was the voice of someone who'd already begun the process of emotional separation. Mom looked between Robert and me, then at Aunt Claire, whose expression was shifting from protective anger to growing uncertainty as she began to read the subtext of the conversation. There's nothing going on, Mom said, but the words lacked conviction. Daphne, I don't know what you think you saw, but I saw you with him, I interrupted. On this couch, 6 weeks ago. I heard you talking about finally being together, about Claire being devastated, about not being able to pretend anymore that what you have with Robert is enough. The silence that followed was so complete. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Aunt Claire's face had gone white, and she was staring at Mom with the expression of someone watching their world crumble in real time. Helen? Aunt Claire whispered. Tell her she's wrong. Mom's composure finally cracked. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, not the delicate tears of earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. How long? Robert asked quietly. 3 years, Mom said without lifting her head. 3 years. The number hit the room like a physical blow. 3 years of deception, of family dinners where everyone smiled and laughed while my mother and Dr. Harrison conducted their secret relationship. 3 years of Aunt Claire trusting her husband and best friend, while both betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. My God, Aunt Claire breathed. Standing up so quickly she knocked over the water glass on the coffee table. 3 years, Helen? 3 years you've been with my husband, and you've been sitting here letting me comfort you? Claire, please. Please what? Please forgive you for destroying my marriage? Please understand that my best friend has been lying to my face for 3 years while sleeping with my husband? Aunt Claire was backing toward the door, her face a mask of betrayal and disbelief. The baby, Helen, is the baby David's? I don't know, Mom whispered. You don't know? Robert's voice cracked with either anger or pain, possibly both. You don't know whose child you're carrying? The timing. It could be either of you. I need a paternity test to be certain. The clinical nature of the statement somehow made it worse. My mother was pregnant and literally didn't know which of the 2 men in her life was the father. The situation had moved beyond simple adultery into territory that felt almost absurd in its complexity. Marcus, who'd been silent since we'd all gathered, finally spoke. Mom, what were you planning to do? Were you going to leave Robert? Were you going to keep the affair secret and raise the baby as his regardless of paternity? I don't know, Mom repeated, the phrase apparently the only thing she was capable of saying with certainty. Well, you're going to have to figure it out, Robert said, moving toward the door. Because I won't be here when you do. He paused in the doorway and looked back at Mom one final time. 30 years, Helen. We've known each other for 30 years, been married for 10, and you threw it all away for someone else's husband. After Robert left, the room felt hollow, like a theater after the final curtain call. Aunt Claire had followed him out, presumably to go home and confront her own husband. Marcus was staring at Mom with a mixture of disappointment and pity that was somehow worse than anger would have been. Are you happy now? Mom asked me, her voice thick with resentment. Is this what you wanted? I wanted the truth, I replied. I'm still waiting for all of it. 2 days after the family implosion, I found myself sitting across from Dr. David Harrison in his medical office after hours, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face that made him look older than his 52 years. He'd called me that morning, asking to meet, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested he'd slept as little as I had since the dinner party confrontation. I owe you an explanation, he said, though his eyes were focused on his hands, rather than my face. Not because I think it will change anything, but because you deserve to understand how this happened. The office where he'd examined me for strep throat and immunized me for college felt surreal, as the setting for this conversation. Childhood memories of him checking my ears and throat competed with the image of him holding my mother in an intimate embrace, creating a cognitive dissonance that made my head ache. "How long have you been in love with her?" I asked, deciding to start with the most fundamental question. "Since before you were born," he replied without hesitation. "I met Helen when she was 22 and working as a nurse at Portland General. I was a first-year resident, completely overwhelmed and exhausted, and she was the most beautiful, competent, intelligent woman I'd ever encountered." He paused, finally looking up to meet my eyes. "She was dating your biological father then, Tom Bradley. He was charming and unpredictable, the kind of man who could make a woman feel like the center of the universe one day and completely forgotten the next. I watched her try to build a life with someone who was fundamentally incapable of commitment or stability. The mention of my biological father surprised me. I'd known Tom Bradley only as a name on my birth certificate and a few photographs Mom kept in a shoebox. He'd left when I was 2 years old, and Mom had always refused to discuss the details of their relationship or his departure. "You were there when he left?" "I was there for all of it. The late-night phone calls when he'd disappear for days without explanation. The times she'd show up at the hospital with bruises she'd try to explain away. The morning she came to work with a black eye and finally admitted he'd hit her." Dr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, lost in memories that clearly still caused him pain. "I was the one who helped her file the restraining order. I was the one who drove her to court when she petitioned for sole custody of you. I was the one who held her while she cried after Tom took everything of value from the apartment and disappeared. But you were married to Claire. I'd married Claire straight out of medical school because she was safe, predictable, from a good family that approved of our match. It was what you were supposed to do in those days. Marry someone suitable and build a respectable life." His voice carried a bitterness that suggested decades of regret. "I loved Claire, but I was never in love with her the way I was with Helen. The distinction felt important, though I wasn't sure I fully understood it. So why didn't you leave Claire for Mom after her divorce?" "Because Helen wasn't ready for another relationship, and I was too much of a coward to break up a marriage for something that might not work out." He rubbed his temples as if trying to massage away a headache. "By the time she started dating again, she'd met Robert, and he was offering her everything she needed: stability, financial security, genuine affection, and a father figure for you. She fell in love with Robert. She convinced herself she had. Robert was everything Tom wasn't: reliable, honest, devoted to family. Helen thought that marrying him was the mature, responsible choice for a single mother trying to build a stable life for her daughter." "Doctor?" Harrison stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the medical complex parking lot, his shoulders tense with the weight of decades of hidden emotion. "The affair started 3 years ago, when Claire and I were going through a rough patch in our marriage. She wanted children, and we'd been trying unsuccessfully for years. The fertility treatments, the disappointments, the stress. It was destroying our relationship and my ability to function as a husband. So you turned to Mom." I ran into Helen at a medical conference in Seattle. Robert was supposed to attend with her, but he'd gotten sick at the last minute. We had dinner, started talking about old times, and for the first time in years, I felt like myself again instead of a failed husband dealing with failed attempts at pregnancy. He turned back to face me, his expression raw with guilt and longing. One dinner led to another, then to phone calls, then to meetings that weren't entirely innocent. We told ourselves we were just friends reconnecting, but we both knew it was more than that. "And now she's pregnant with what might be your child." "Yes," he said simply, "and regardless of paternity, I've destroyed 2 marriages and likely lost the only woman I've ever truly loved." I found Robert at the lake house 3 days later, sitting on the dock where he'd taught Marcus and me to fish during the early years of his marriage to Mom. The October air was sharp enough to make my breath visible, but he seemed oblivious to the cold, staring out at water that reflected the gray sky like tarnished silver. "I wondered if you'd come looking for me," he said without turning around as I approached, his voice carrying a weariness that made him sound decades older than his 55 years. "Marcus is worried about you. You haven't been answering your phone." I needed time to think without everyone watching me for reactions. He gestured to the empty chair beside him on the dock. "Sit down, Daphne. I think it's time we had a conversation that's probably 15 years overdue." I settled into the weathered Adirondack chair, noting how the familiar setting made this surreal situation feel even more disorienting. This dock had been the site of countless family moments: birthday celebrations, quiet conversations, the morning Robert had asked for my blessing before proposing to Mom. How long have you known? I asked. Robert's laugh was bitter and humorless. Which part? How long have I known Helen was having an affair? Or how long have I known she was never really in love with me? The second part of his question hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean? Your mother married me for security, Daphne. For stability and financial support and a father figure for her children. She was very honest about her motivations from the beginning, though I was too infatuated to pay attention to the distinction between gratitude and love. He pulled out his phone and showed me a text message thread that made my stomach clench with recognition. The messages were between him and Mom, but they read more like business communications than intimate exchanges between spouses. Discussions about schedules, household expenses, and logistical arrangements with no trace of affection or warmth. This is what our marriage has looked like for years, Robert continued. Polite cooperation and shared responsibilities, but no real intimacy or emotional connection. Helen has been going through the motions of being a wife while waiting for something better to come along. But you seemed happy together. I was happy. Helen was content. There's a difference, though it took me embarrassingly long to recognize it. Robert pocketed his phone and returned his gaze to the water. I knew about David 6 months ago. The admission hung in the cold air between us like fog. 6 months? How? I hired a private investigator when Helen started working late several nights a week at a job she'd supposedly taken part-time at David's practice. The investigator confirmed what I'd already suspected. She wasn't working late. She was meeting him at various hotels and restaurants around the city. I felt sick. Why didn't you confront her? Because I was hoping it was a phase, something she needed to get out of her system before returning to our marriage. I thought if I pretended not to know, if I gave her space to make her own choices, she might eventually choose our family. Robert stood up and walked to the edge of the dock, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Then she told me she was pregnant, and I knew immediately that the timing didn't align with our intimate encounters, which had become increasingly rare. But I also knew that confronting her would force decisions neither of us was ready to make. So you were going to raise David's child as your own? If that's what it took to keep our family together? Yes. Marcus was already an adult. You were married and starting your own life. But Helen? I couldn't imagine my world without her in it, even if she was only there out of obligation rather than love. The depth of Robert's willingness to sacrifice his own dignity for the illusion of family unity was both heartbreaking and disturbing. He'd been prepared to live with the knowledge of his wife's infidelity and raise another man's child, rather than face the possibility of losing her entirely. What changed your mind? You did, he said simply. When you announced the truth at dinner, you forced me to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding. Helen wasn't going to end the affair voluntarily. She was going to continue the deception indefinitely, letting me believe the child was mine while maintaining her relationship with David. Robert turned back to face me, and I could see tears in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. I've spent 10 years trying to be worthy of a woman who was never really mine to begin with. I can't do it anymore. What happens now? Now I figure out how to rebuild my life at 55, how to move forward from a marriage that was probably doomed from the beginning but felt real enough to me. He managed a weak smile. And I try to maintain relationships with you and Marcus, while accepting that Helen will always be part of your lives. You'll always be my dad, Robert. That doesn't change because of what Mom did. I hope that's true, he replied, because losing you and Marcus would be worse than losing Helen. My brother Marcus called an emergency family meeting for the following Saturday, choosing neutral territory, a conference room at the hotel where he worked as an event coordinator. The formal setting felt appropriately sterile for what promised to be a difficult conversation, and I suspected Marcus had chosen it specifically to prevent anyone from storming out dramatically or creating the kind of scene that had marked our last family gathering. I arrived early, taking a seat at the polished conference table and trying to mentally prepare for whatever Marcus had planned. He'd been unusually cryptic when he'd called to arrange the meeting, saying only that decisions needed to be made and that continuing to avoid each other wasn't helping anyone process the situation. Mom arrived next, looking like she'd aged 5 years in the past week. Her usually perfect appearance had been replaced by an exhausted casualness that spoke to sleepless nights and emotional upheaval. She nodded at me briefly before taking a seat across the table, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized our interaction since the dinner party confrontation. Robert entered a few minutes later, followed immediately by Dr. Harrison and Aunt Claire. The sight of all the primary players in our family drama seated around one table felt surreal. like a board meeting to discuss the dissolution of a corporation, rather than the unraveling of relationships that had defined our lives for decades. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began once everyone was seated. "I know this is uncomfortable for everyone, but we need to address the practical aspects of what's happening, instead of just letting emotions control everything." He stood at the head of the table with a legal pad covered in notes, looking more like a mediator than someone whose own family was imploding around him. "First, Mom, you need to get a paternity test as soon as medically safe. Everyone deserves to know the biological facts before making permanent decisions about relationships and responsibilities." Mom nodded reluctantly, though she didn't look at either Robert or Dr. Harrison as she agreed. "Second, Robert and Dr. Harrison, you both need to decide what kind of relationship, if any, you want to maintain with this family regardless of paternity results. Walking away completely would be understandable, but it would also affect Daphne and me, and we deserve to know where we stand." Robert cleared his throat. "Marcus, I want to be very clear about this. My relationship with you and Daphne doesn't depend on my relationship with your mother. You're both adults who I love and respect, and I hope you'll continue to consider me family regardless of what happens between Helen and me. And if the baby is yours," Marcus asked, "then I'll be a father to that child. But Helen and I are finished as a couple. The betrayal has been too extensive and too long-term for me to continue the marriage." Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "I want to take responsibility for my part in this situation. I pursued a relationship with Helen despite knowing the damage it would cause to multiple families. If the child is mine, I'll provide financial support and be involved in their life, but I understand that my presence in this family is no longer welcome." "What about your marriage to Claire?" Marcus asked directly. Aunt Claire answered before her husband could respond. "Our marriage is over. I filed for divorce and I'm moving back to Sacramento to be closer to my sister's family. I can't—" She trailed off, looking at Mom with an expression of profound sadness. "I can't rebuild my life in a place where I'll constantly run into the people who destroyed it." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this information somehow made it more devastating than if she'd been angry or emotional. Aunt Claire, who'd been part of our family for as long as I could remember, was simply leaving, erasing herself from our lives to escape the pain of betrayal. "Third," Marcus continued, consulting his notes, "we need to discuss how this affects extended family relationships. Uncle James has already made it clear that his business partnership with Dr. Harrison is ending, which means David will need to find a new practice. I'm moving to Portland," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "I've accepted a position with a medical group there. It's better for everyone if I'm not practicing in the same city." Marcus made a note on his pad. "Finally, we need to discuss how to handle family gatherings, holidays, and other events going forward. The current situation isn't sustainable. I won't be attending family functions where Helen is present," Aunt Claire said firmly. "And I'd prefer that my children not be subjected to this drama until they're old enough to understand the adult complexities involved. That eliminates most of the traditional family gatherings," Marcus observed. "Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthdays, they'll all need to be restructured or duplicated to accommodate everyone's boundaries." I'd been silent throughout most of the meeting, but the logistical discussion of dismantling family traditions finally prompted me to speak. "This is what I wanted to prevent," I said. "This complete destruction of our family structure." "No," Marcus replied gently but firmly. "This is what Mom and David's choices created. You just forced us to acknowledge it instead of continuing to live a lie." He looked around the table, studying each face before delivering his final point. "The last thing we need to address is blame and forgiveness. Everyone in this room has been hurt by this situation, but continuing to attack each other isn't going to repair anything. We can choose to focus on moving forward constructively, or we can choose to let resentment destroy whatever relationships might be salvageable." "What are you saying, Marcus?" Mom asked. "I'm saying that I love all of you, but I won't choose sides or enable anyone's destructive behavior. If you want to be part of my life going forward, you'll need to take responsibility for your choices and work toward healing, rather than just defending yourselves." A week after Marcus's family summit, Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced at 9 p.m., standing in my doorway with red-rimmed eyes and the desperate energy of someone who'd exhausted all other options. She was holding a manila envelope that she clutched like a lifeline, and when I invited her inside, she moved with the careful precision of someone who was barely holding themselves together. "I need you to understand something," she said, before I could offer her coffee or ask why she'd come. "About your father, your real father, Tom Bradley. There are things I never told you because I thought protecting you from the truth was more important than honesty. She sat down on my couch and opened the envelope, revealing photographs I'd never seen and documents that looked official and ominous. The first photograph showed a younger version of my mother, with a man who looked nothing like the few pictures I'd seen of Tom Bradley. This man was taller, darker, with features that were distinctly familiar in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden understanding. "That's not Tom Bradley," I said, though I was already recognizing the face in the photograph. "No," Mom replied quietly. "That's David Harrison, 28 years ago, before he married Claire, before I convinced myself I could build a life with someone else." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the photograph. My mother, barely older than I was now, smiling up at Dr. Harrison with the radiant happiness of someone completely in love. They were standing in front of a church, and Mom was wearing a white dress that could have been a wedding gown, or could have been any special occasion outfit. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to understand all too well. Mom pulled out a marriage certificate dated 29 years ago, signed by Helen Morrison and David Harrison. The document was real, official, undeniably authentic. "We were married for 6 months, Mom continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 6 months before Claire convinced him he was making a mistake, before his family made it clear that a poor nurse wasn't suitable for a doctor from their social class. But Tom Bradley was a fiction I created to explain your existence after David left me. I was pregnant, abandoned, and too proud to admit that my husband had annulled our marriage to be with someone more socially acceptable." Mom handed me another document, an annulment decree that legally erased the marriage I'd never known had existed. The implications were staggering. Dr. Harrison wasn't just my mother's current lover. He was her first husband, my biological father, the man who'd walked away from us both to marry Aunt Claire and build the respectable life his family demanded. "David is my father," I said, the words feeling strange and wrong in my mouth. "Yes, and he's known it for 15 years, ever since he became our family physician and had access to your medical records. He's been watching you grow up, treating your illnesses, giving you guidance, while pretending to be nothing more than a family friend." I felt sick. Every interaction I'd had with Dr. Harrison throughout my childhood and adolescence was suddenly recontextualized. The extra attention he'd always paid to my academic achievements, the way he'd encouraged my college plans, his presence at my wedding 3 years ago, all of it took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of a father secretly watching his daughter's life from a distance. Does Robert know? No, and neither does Marcus. He's actually Robert's biological son from a brief relationship Robert had before we got serious. Robert has never known that Marcus isn't biologically mine. The revelations kept coming like blows to the chest. Marcus, the brother I'd grown up with, wasn't actually my brother. Robert, the man I'd called my stepfather, was actually Marcus's biological father, who'd been raising his own son without knowing it. So, when you announced your pregnancy, I was announcing that David and I might finally have the chance to raise a child together, something we were denied 30 years ago when he chose respectability over love. Mom stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the street with the hollow expression of someone who'd revealed their deepest secrets and wasn't sure what came next. "I know what I did was wrong," she continued. "I know I hurt Robert and Claire and destroyed their trust. But Daphne, you have to understand, David and I never stopped loving each other. For 30 years, we've been living parallel lives, pretending to be happy with other people while knowing we belong together. So you decided to have an affair instead of getting divorced and being honest about your feelings. We were both cowards," she admitted, "too afraid of judgment, too concerned about disrupting everyone else's lives, too comfortable with the financial security our marriages provided. But when I got pregnant, we knew we couldn't continue the deception." She turned back to face me, her expression desperate with the need for understanding or forgiveness, or both. "I came here tonight because I need you to know the whole truth before you decide whether you can ever forgive me. David is your father. I was his wife before I was Robert's, and this baby represents our second chance at the family we should have had from the beginning." The DNA results came back on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered via certified mail to both Mom and Robert, with copies sent to Dr. Harrison, and the lawyer Marcus had insisted on retaining to handle the legal aspects of our family's dissolution. I was at work when Mom called, her voice shaking as she read the results that would determine the biological paternity of the child she was carrying. "The baby is David's," she said simply, and I could hear both relief and terror in those 5 words. Relief, because the uncertainty was finally over, and terror, because now all the hypothetical consequences of the affair would become brutally real. Robert could now move forward with his divorce, knowing definitively that he wasn't walking away from his own child. Dr. Harrison would become a father at 52, 30 years after abandoning his first family, and Mom would finally have the baby she'd always wanted with the man she'd never stopped loving. But the DNA results had revealed something else, something that Mom's voice couldn't quite conceal as she continued speaking. There's something else, Daphne. Something about your own paternity that I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else. My hands went cold as I gripped the phone. What do you mean? The lab ran additional tests when I requested confirmation of your biological relationship to David for family medical history purposes. The results show... She paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase what came next. You're not David's biological daughter either. The words hit me like a physical blow. After yesterday's revelation that Dr. Harrison was supposedly my father, after a week of recontextualizing my entire childhood through the lens of that relationship, I was being told that was also a lie. Then who is my father? Robert, Mom whispered. You're Robert's biological daughter. The timeline I created around Tom Bradley was false, but so was the story I told you last week about being married to David. I've been lying for so long I'm not even sure I remember the truth anymore. I sat down heavily in my office chair, trying to process the latest reversal in a family story that seemed to change every time someone revealed another secret. According to Mom's newest version, I was Robert's biological daughter, which meant the man I'd called my stepfather for 15 years was actually my biological father, who'd never known he had a daughter. How is that possible? You said you were married to David. I was married to David, but only for 3 months, not 6, and it was before I got pregnant with you. After the annulment, I had a brief relationship with Robert. We'd met through mutual friends, and he was kind to me during a very difficult time. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked and told him the baby wasn't his because I thought he deserved better than being trapped by an unplanned pregnancy. So, you created Tom Bradley to explain my existence? Yes. And I let Robert believe he was doing me a favor by marrying me and adopting you, when the truth was he was unknowingly claiming his own biological daughter. The complexity of the deception was staggering. For 28 years, Robert had believed he was my stepfather, generously raising another man's child out of love for my mother. For 28 years, I'd believed the same thing, grateful for his paternal care while never knowing he was actually my biological father. Does Robert know yet? The lawyer is calling him this afternoon with the results. But Daphne, there's one more thing you need to know before this all comes out. I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation, but I stayed on the line, waiting for whatever final piece of our family puzzle Mom was about to reveal. Marcus isn't Robert's son. He's David's. I got pregnant again during one of our reconnection periods early in my marriage to Robert, but I let Robert believe Marcus was his because I couldn't admit I was still seeing David. The final piece clicked into place with sickening clarity. Marcus, who I'd grown up thinking was my half-brother through Mom, was actually my half-brother through Dr. Harrison. Robert, who I'd thought was my stepfather, was actually my biological father. Dr. Harrison, who I'd been told was my biological father, was actually my stepfather, who'd never known he was raising his own son. So Marcus and I are both products of your affair with David, I said slowly. No, Mom corrected. You're Robert's daughter from before I married him. Marcus is David's son from during my marriage to Robert. The affair has been on and off for almost 30 years, Daphne. Every time I tried to make my marriage work, every time I tried to be the wife Robert deserved, I'd end up back with David. And the baby you're carrying now is David's, conceived during our most recent reconciliation. This time we're not going to lie about it or try to make it work with other people. We're going to be together, finally, after 3 decades of deception. I hung up the phone and sat in my office, staring out the window at traffic that seemed to move with purpose, while my own life felt like it had been completely derailed. In the span of 2 weeks, I'd learned that my biological father was actually the man who'd raised me, that my brother was actually my half-brother through a different parent than I'd assumed, and that my mother had been conducting an on-and-off affair for 30 years while building her life on an elaborate foundation of lies. The family gathering where this had all started felt like it had happened in a different lifetime, when the worst thing I'd thought I was revealing was a simple extramarital affair. Instead, I'd uncovered a web of deception that had shaped every relationship in our family for 3 decades. 6 months later, I stood in the maternity ward of the hospital where Dr. Harrison, David, now worked, holding my newborn half-sister while trying to reconcile all the complex emotions that had been building since our family's spectacular implosion. Baby Sarah was beautiful in the way all newborns are, but also unmistakably David's daughter, with his dark hair and the distinctive nose that I could now see Marcus had inherited as well. "She's perfect," I told Mom, who was sitting up in bed looking exhausted, but genuinely happy for the first time in months. The past 6 months had been a period of careful reconstruction for all of us. Robert and Mom's divorce had been finalized in February, with Robert maintaining his relationship with Marcus as his adopted son, despite learning that Marcus wasn't biologically his. Dr. Harrison had divorced Claire and relocated to Portland, where he and Mom were finally building the life they'd apparently wanted for 30 years. Most surprisingly, Robert had embraced his role as my biological father, with a joy that seemed to make up for decades of believing he was merely a stepfather doing his duty. Learning that I was actually his daughter had given him something positive to focus on during the painful process of ending his marriage and watching Mom move on with another man. "Have you chosen godparents yet?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "We want you and Marcus," Mom replied, "if you're willing. I know it's asking a lot after everything that's happened, but you're both the most important people in our lives, and we want you to be part of Sarah's story from the beginning." Marcus, who'd been standing quietly by the window, turned to face us. "I'll do it," he said simply. "But I have conditions." "Name them," David said from his position beside Mom's bed, where he was studying his daughter with the wonder of a man who'd never expected to become a father. "No more lies," Marcus said firmly. "No more secrets. No more elaborate deceptions to protect people from uncomfortable truths. If we're going to be a family, whatever that looks like now, it has to be built on honesty." "Agreed," Mom said immediately. "And everyone has to accept that our family structure is permanently changed. Robert is Daphne's father and my adopted dad. David is my biological father and Sarah's father. You and David are together now, but that doesn't erase the pain you caused other people to get here." David nodded solemnly. "I know we have a lot to make up for." "You can't make up for it," Marcus continued. "You can only do better going forward. That means acknowledging the damage you caused, respecting the boundaries other people need to heal, and accepting that some relationships may never be repaired." Aunt Claire had indeed moved to Sacramento and maintained no contact with any of us. Uncle James had ended his business partnership with David and limited his interaction with Mom to necessary family functions. Several cousins and extended family members had essentially chosen sides, creating a network of family gatherings that required careful coordination to avoid putting people in uncomfortable positions. "The third condition," Marcus said, "is that Sarah grows up knowing the truth about our family history. Age-appropriate truth, but truth nonetheless. She doesn't get raised on false stories about her parents or siblings." "Of course," Mom agreed. I looked down at baby Sarah, who was sleeping peacefully despite the complex family dynamics swirling around her birth. In many ways, she represented both the culmination of 30 years of deception and the beginning of something more honest, if more complicated. "I'll be her godmother," I said finally, "but I need something from you too, Mom. Anything. I need you to get counseling. Not couples counseling with David, but individual therapy to figure out why you spent 30 years lying to people you claimed to love, instead of making difficult but honest choices." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I've already started. Dr. Martinez recommended someone who specializes in families dealing with long-term deception and betrayal." "Good, because Sarah deserves to grow up with a mother who's learned healthier ways to handle conflict and difficult emotions." David cleared his throat. "Daphne, I want you to know that I understand if you never feel comfortable calling me Dad. I know Robert filled that role in your life, and I respect that relationship." "You're right," I replied. "Robert is my dad in every way that matters, but you're also family now, and I'm willing to figure out what that looks like as we go." As I prepared to leave the hospital that evening, I reflected on how dramatically our family had changed since that dinner party in October. We'd lost some relationships. Aunt Claire, several extended family members, the illusion of stability we'd built our lives around. But we'd also gained honesty, clearer boundaries, and the possibility of authentic relationships built on truth rather than convenient fiction. Baby Sarah would grow up in a family where divorce, remarriage, half-siblings, and complex loyalties were simply facts of life rather than shameful secrets to be hidden. She'd know that families came in many forms, that love could survive difficult truths, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to enable other people's lies. It wasn't the family I'd imagined growing up in, but it was real, and after 30 years of fiction, real felt like a gift.